In actual fact, America owes around the world trillions of dollars in terms of its trade deficit and how much it owes around the world. In the past, it has gone so much into borrowing and trying to cope in terms of national and international financial strength. However, is it that America is that poor that she cannot inherit herself and be financially capable enough to handle its issues? Well, the more we demand, the more America owes the world, the more we're fond to keep using the dollars. And the more we use the dollars, the more we are tied to America, we're attached to America. And so, according to Trump, it's time to pull off from the world, even though there is that benefit in the sense that the more America owes the world, the more we rely on America and vice versa. This is a good policy for the globalist, but not a populist. So it's time for America to isolate itself and gradually back off from international leadership tendency. Now that's what Trump is trying to do. That's why we have Trump today saying they must revise the aid they give around the world, the US aid that they give around the world, because it ties more with the socialist principle, Marxist principle, and which of course favors the globalist. And so why a lot of socialism, meanwhile breaking the capitalist world that America is the leader. And so the more socialism, the more boundaries will fall and the world will become one. On the other hand, precautions are being taken by the populists to make sure that capitalism is at the talk of the day and strengthening whether national or international politics or policy or polite tendency is being carried forward. Like I earlier said, the UN is an international body that best describes and does the regulation in terms of international relations and diplomacy, whether in economics, politics, or socioeconomic tendencies. One of this that really has a profound insight and in-depth in terms of definition is the IMF, International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund was created in the 1940s after the First and Second World War, and with an impetus to 1920s and 30s economic depression that struck the globe. Why was the IMF created? The IMF was created to solve economic depression. The economic depression in itself was characterized by the fact that the stock market, number one, the stock market had crashed. The stock market had crashed. In other words, spending and investment, who will buy and who will sell? In other words, after the First and Second World War, the capitalists were taking the lead while the communists were backing off in terms of approach. The communists wanted more of the socialist tendency, of which they tried and they never could thrive as much as possible. Meanwhile, the capitalists decided to push forward a sense of capitalism that is to say, they must entrust capital to you and you must manage on an individual basis for you to thrive rather than depending on a general point of view to solve issues. Now, we have the aspect of production. So demand and supply was threatened, which is of course one of the fundamental roots of capitalism. Who will buy and who will sell? So the definition of the Great Depression was based on the fact that the stock market had to fail. There was a crash because so much production had been done. And then, of course, who will buy and who will sell to who? And so there was a need to revise for capitalism to thrive. They had understood that much more that had to exist around the world to succeed was capitalist tendency and not socialism or communist tendency. Next to it was the fact that not only the stock market crashed, but also you had banks that collapsed. Banks were the stock of the capitalists, where they kept their finances and did a sense of regulation. Now the banks had to collapse. In other words, the bank had to lend it money, they had to lend money to the different markets for demand and supply, where the supply had reached a level being exhausted like never before. So the banks had to crash because, on the other hand, um, regulation, they couldn't regulate anymore. Production was there, and because production was there, markets had to lose their taste, because if you produce a chicken, I produce a chicken, you produce a chicken, who consumes, who buys? So capitalist, the exchange of goods and services was no longer there. And so bank that is in charge of doing the regulations also had to collapse. She giving money, so people couldn't refund because they were not able to sell, and refuel the banks in order to exist, because the bank is the think tank to demand and supply. That's why the banks had to collapse. Thirdly was the fact that gold standards had to be inspired or imposed after the Great Depression. In other words, let us redefine monetary tendency. And to redefine monetary tendency, we needed something from the exchange in terms of value of goods and services. This, of course, had to do with currency. So what will back the currency? It was agreed that gold, which was of the most outstanding standard in terms of commodity, would be the strength of definition. How much gold you can procure and acquire should be the standard to define who owns what share in the market in terms of monetary capacity. And so, no more could individuals showcase the strength of their finances without being backed up with gold acquisition. Fourthly was the definition to international market. In other words, the IMF became the referee of who produces what and who consumes what. In other words, you don't just go ahead in the capitalist world to produce. You must search for a market before you produce. More to it was the fact that the IMF, based on your currency, will determine your sales capacity. In other words, if you're producing maize, maize is going to go to 5 countries or 5 regions. That will be your market space, so we don't fight anymore. And that there is regulation in terms of production so the banks can sustain in terms of credit and debit tendency, so that the banks can sustain. And so regulation was carried by the IMF on who produces what and who consumes. That, of course, determines why America will decide to produce a certain percentage of oil or petroleum that will go around the world and that it will consume as well. It is not that it was not aware of the wells that does or did exist per se, but in other words, the IMF, who is the policymaker, determines the share of oil that goes to the world, who buys from who. And that is why the past presidents have never touched the oil wells that Donald Trump is about to exploit or increase in terms of supply. Now, if everybody were to produce their oil wells, who will demand and who will supply? So there's going to be there's going to be a crash in terms of, there's going to be another Great Depression, okay, in economic terms per se, in terms of market policy. So the IMF was there to regulate all this, or it has been there and still is there. But is it still relevant? According to the Populist, the IMF is no longer relevant. But the Globalists say it should still be in possession of the world market. Now, so after this, is based on the fact that, or the fifth point, which is based on spirituality and secularity. Spiritually, the populist or the capitalist believe so much in God. religious tendency. Why the globalists don't want to believe so much in God. They don't want God to regulate their stuffs or an ideology about God and spirituality to regulate their issues. That's why there's that differences. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Russia, a former communist bloc, chose or decided to join NATO, pleaded and knocked at the door of NATO, and since then, this door has never been opened because the communist world or the socialists don't believe so much in God and they don't even want to hear so much about God. So if Russia is coming in to NATO, while NATO in its creation, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was to check the communist bloc and to make sure that they're in control. All right. So now, if one of the fathers or co-fathers of communism has decided to join NATO, is he in good faith? So there's a lot of suspicion in relation to that, and that is why it has been isolated so long a time, and they've never believed in the faith of Russia joining NATO. Spirituality, secularity, that is the bone of contention. Now, in this all, the populists believe in God we trust. Capitalism, in God we trust. The fathers or co-fathers of capitalism, in God we trust. Communism, socialism, you are God and there is no God at all. So, are you coming as a spy or you're coming as a partner? That has been the bone of contention, even to the point whereby this time around we have Putin, President Putin of Russia, who has a religious phase compared to former Russian heads of states. Still, there is that nostalgia, there is that fear, and that still is among the capitalist world not to believe the good faith of Russia per se. This is a spy that is trying to infiltrate us, and we don't believe that Russia believes in God we trust. However, Donald Trump believes that there is somebody in the communist world that they must trust in the person of Putin. Putin is religious inclined. Putin stands and upholds to Christian values. You can think about against homosexuality, against some extreme views and the social behavior, and he's putting forth stringent policies in terms of that. So Donald Trump sees him as a faithful partner that they should believe. Just like in those days, Barnabas was able to make sure that Paul was accepted by the apostles, even though Paul in those days, who was Saul, was known as a persecutor. But then, that is not a guarantor or a guarantee per se. And that's why the capitalist world is still under fear of who Putin is. It could still be a spy and not a true friend to the system. Probably try to break it up. On the other hand, Russia is looking for a way not really to integrate anymore in NATO, but to say, after the First and Second World War, we choose never to fight each other. Market space was being developed. The IMF had to do the regulations. I was cheated because I had weapons strong as a nuclear power, but economic strength, I was down. So in trying to do the shares, I was cheated. Because I was cheated, I must gain space and time as soon as possible. And in trying to gain space and time as soon as possible, there is a need to fight. Now, the capitalists don't want to revise so much in terms of previous agreements or policies. Um, and then, of course, Russia and China, they have said we are also big in terms of capitalism policy, and we need to occupy our former space. So the West and America come back to the negotiation table and give us the territories we lost yesterday. That's the point. And so Would that really be the point, the bone of discussion now, the bone of contention now? Well, what is your take about this? And hope to get your comments. Donald J. Trump, the United States president, 47th president, has ordered the increase of petroleum production in the U.S. of A. What accounts for this increase? Is it that previous U.S. presidents were not aware or had common sense or smart as he is? Not at all. I think he has something in mind. He has an expression to carry forth. This expression is based on the populist and the globalist view. The populists believe that it is time to reinforce international boundaries and develop each country upon its strengths and weaknesses rather than depending on the strengths and weaknesses of the international world as a whole. The globalists believe it's time for international boundaries to be broken and shattered, and once more we should move to a global village whereby we should have a one world system tomorrow that will be able to contain that will be able to contain issues, socioeconomic issues around the world. This in itself, according to them, will definitely stop or reduce the wars that are stepping up in the multiplication of challenges in global leadership. According to the populists, or in the figure of Donald J. Trump, 47th president, the IMF or the UN as a whole is obsolete in terms of world challenges, and something else has to develop along the way. The IMF, of course, was created in the 1940s after the First and Second World War in order that countries or superpowers will no longer fight for market space and demand and supply per se. The second was based on the fact that they will determine who is going to supply what and the quantity to where it's going to go to. This, of course, was why the IMF was created. In other words, in the 1920s and 30s, we learned of the Great Depression in the world. The Great Depression that plagued the world and caused a lot of chaos. The Great Depression was characterized by the following. Stock markets had to crash. There was a crash in terms of stock markets. In other words, who was supposed to produce and who was supposed to consume. There was a marathon between the fact that they had studied the capitalist system. So the faster you produce and the more you produce, the more you gain space and importance. So a lot was being produced and there was no market to consume. This had to lead to the chairman of the capitalist world, which is the banking system. So the banking system had to collapse. In other words, she had given a lot of money out, lent a lot of money, but in order to maintain the credit and debit system for it to continue to function became difficult. So this, of course, had to lead to the capitalist world collapsed in itself. In other words, there were no more jobs or no way to turn demand and supply, which is the backbone of the capitalist system. And so things became difficult. Gold standard had to be imposed. In other words, the currency of every nation had to be determined by the IMF. Okay? That is, your currency determines the space and strength you occupy in international trade. So the more gold packed or stock you do have, the stronger your economy and the stronger your currency. That is a description to your goods and services. More to it was based on the fact that the international market space had to be described. And this led to the fact that America had to reduce, or America had to control through the IMF who is the market and who is the producer. So being the master of this, America in itself, or the US of A, had to limit its oil production, even though she had several wells in existence. The same had to be done by other capitalist states in order to thrive the capitalist system. But today, is Donald J. Trump saying that it's obsolete? In his policies, one may see that he is in demand of a new world order. While the globalists, on the other hand, are demanding for a new world order, but this time there should be a one world system that we're gradually moving into. This, of course, leads to the fifth, not the least point, which has to do with spirituality and secularity. Of course, the capitalist in God we trust, with its children around the world, believes so much in God, and according to spiritual standards, they don't want to face a global world with a one world system. This, of course, will shatter its number one priority to maintain its strength. On the other hand, is a socialist or the communist bloc that is strongly coming up and that believes that she has grown mature and strong enough to speak like the capitalist yesterday. In other words, you cheated us after the First and Second World War because we're not economic viable as you are or you were. So we want to gain back the space that we occupied yesterday, our territories, which will redefine our market or demand and supply in terms of goods and services. That's why for so long a time, Russia, through Putin, has been pushing forward to make sure that restitution takes place. Now, in this, of course, Putin has a dual face, not only clamoring for restitution, but also he stands as a spiritual or religious figure. He's Christian inclined. He doesn't believe in globalist view. He's so strong about God, about spirituality. And so Donald Trump believes he should partner with this kind of a person that is showing this kind of a face. He should be trustworthy as an individual. Whereas on the other hand, the capitalist world is scared that Russia may be a spy that is coming to completely destroy the capitalist system or to bring it to its shame, per se. Like in the 40s, the communism was brought to its knees. So this is a revenge tendency and we shouldn't believe at all. That is why since the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Russia glamoring and struggling to enter NATO has never been given the opportunity, let alone to be part of this North Atlantic Treaty Organization that in its first place was put there to do the checks and balances with the socialist and the communist system. Around the world, aid is being diminished in terms of production, US aid in quotes. This, of course, is a way to stop funding socialism, okay, which supports the Marxist tendency and almost leads to the communist system once more. And that is why aid is being reduced all over the world, so the capitalists will try in order to maintain capitalism in its widest strength and capacity. Well, what is your take in relation to this? Of course, that's my analysis, and I hope to hear from you soonest. Bye-bye for now.